The Marjorie P. Hinckley Endowed Chair is a financial endowment that funds not only this lecture this evening, but a range of other activities. It funds faculty research and mentored learning grants to promote student collaboration in faculty research. We also have student scholarships and internships affiliated with this endowment, and students are also provided with funds to travel to professional conferences to share the results of their research with a broader audience. We're grateful to all the generous donors who have contributed to this endowment and made these activities possible. At this point, we want to share a brief tribute video for the Marjorie P. Hinckley Endowed Chair. This will better acquaint you with Sister Hinckley's warmth, character, and faith.
On April 29th, 2003, the Brigham Young University College of Family, Home, and Social Sciences announced the establishment of an endowed chair in the name of Marjorie P. Hinckley. The chair is a fitting tribute to an extraordinary lady and her lifelong commitment to the development of the whole woman and the strengthening of parents and children. Wife of Gordon B. Hinckley, 15th President of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, Marjorie frequently accompanied her husband on trips of goodwill across the globe. Over the years, she left a powerful impression of virtue and kindness with millions of people who affectionately referred to this loving matriarch simply as Sister Hinckley.
I try to make people feel comfortable with what they are and who they are, and let them know that they're appreciated, that they're making a contribution. They are. People generally are good. In the church or out of the church, people are good.
It was in the spring of 1937, as America struggled in the grip of the Great Depression, that Marjorie P. married Gordon B. Hinckley in the Salt Lake Temple. But in spite of economic challenges, Sister Hinckley faced life with a bright outlook that would eventually become one of her trademarks.
Just before the wedding, Dad confessed to Mother that his total net worth consisted of a $150 savings account, and that perhaps they should postpone their marriage until he could accumulate enough to support her. In her typical cheerful way, she exclaimed, "All I was expecting was a husband. And now I had $150 as well." I was thrilled.
When I look back upon our early years, I tremble to think of the little money that we had to live on. I earned a very small salary, but that was the bottom of the Depression. A few dollars bought a substantial supply of groceries, and we made it all right. We built a pleasant home in East Mill Creek and settled down and reared our family there. 3 daughters, 2 sons. It was a very lively household, and the mother of those children was the very center of it. She was a tremendous worker, a hard worker. She was always planting flowers, doing this, doing that, beautifying the home, serving in the church in a variety of capacities, and rearing her children. She's been the lodestar of their lives, and they all look back to her as the source of inspiration and one to have a happy time with. They love her, she loves them.
A central figure in her own family, Sister Hinckley also became a champion for the family both here and abroad. As she traveled the world, the counsel she gave centered on building stronger, happier homes.
Mothering really is hard.
Even at this age.
But it doesn't mean you can't love it. And so I would say to all of you, have joy in your mothering. Especially wonderful were the summers when the children were young and home where I could be the boss. I did my best to keep those summers unstructured so that they'd have time to explore and lie on their backs and listen to the birds
Mother, over the years, your advice and influence has shaped my life. What message would you like to share with these women today?
I don't know. Don't worry, I've got it written here. My advice is to be the best person you can be. Profound, isn't it?
Although her impact on those around her was profound, it was Sister Hinckley's sense of humor that many recognized as her most endearing trait, one that was manifested consistently in her relationship with her husband.
We learned long ago that you can't take life too seriously. You just have to laugh your way through.
I love this dear companion of mine. We've been at it a long time, and to her I give all the credit for the virtues of our family, including our children and our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren. She holds a very bright spot in their hearts, as do I. And my love for her extends over a very long period of time, and I expect it will go on forever.
The quiet conviction shared by President and Sister Hinckley held throughout the church that a loving bond uniting husband, wife, and children is one of the cornerstones of a strong society and a stable world. Yet statistics showing the disintegration of the family are alarmingly common across the globe. Divorce, neglect, abuse, abortion, addiction, sorrow, and despair, it would seem, are running rampant worldwide. But to the ever-optimistic Marjorie Hinckley, these problems presented opportunities to make a difference. Her answers were rooted in love, compassion, and a desire to uplift others.
It's no wonder that Sister Hinckley has been described as charity personified, and we are honored to help perpetuate her legacy of love and concern for families and children this evening. Scott Braithwaite, the director of BYU's Relationship Health Lab and associate professor in psychology, will now provide a formal introduction for Dr. Scott Stanley, who will deliver tonight's Marjorie Hinckley lecture.
Dr. Scott Stanley is a research professor and co-director of the University of Denver's Center for Marital and Family Studies. His research focuses on cohabitation, communication, conflict, and risk factors for divorce, as well as the prevention of marital distress and couple development before marriage. For over 30 years, Dr. Stanley and his colleagues have researched, developed, and refined the Prevention and Relationship Enhancement Program, or PrEP, which produces and refines relationship education materials. With PrEP, Dr. Stanley and his colleagues have provided training to the U.S. Armed Forces as well as to organizations across the U.S. and around the world. His research has added greatly to the understanding of premarital cohabitation, asymmetrical commitment, and how relationship experiences before marriage influence marriage outcomes. Dr. Stanley's research on commitment and relationship development has also extensively influenced efforts designed to help individuals improve their relationship decision-making when it comes to consequential relationships. Dr. Stanley has published widely and provides input on research projects around the country. He is a co-author or author of numerous books, including Fighting for Your Marriage, A Lasting Promise, and The Power of Commitment, as well as a blog on relationship development, commitment, cohabitation, and relationship education. It is called Sliding versus Deciding. On a more personal note, Scott is someone that I genuinely admire and consider a good friend. When I was a first-year graduate student, I think like a lot of first-year graduate students, I was convinced that I was going to change the world through psychology. More specifically, I had the idea that I wanted to get our very best premarital relationship education out to the people. I knew that PrEP, which was developed by Scott and Howard Markman, was the best premarital intervention, and that those who got it had a 50% reduction or risk reduction for their divorce relative to those who didn't. And I thought I wanted to take these principles that made PrEP so effective and to make it so they could be delivered online. Scott was friends with my mentor, Frank Fincham, and he graciously collaborated with me and encouraged me in my work. At the time, I was a nameless first-year graduate student who was likely to create extra hassle in his life, and I was across the country at Florida State, not even at his university. But I learned then, as I have many times since then, that Scott is someone who is kind and generous even when he has no good reason to be. Lots of times in fields like psychology, you feel pressured to pick a tribe. As a lot of people in psychology or other clinical professions feel, you can either be a scientist or you can be a practitioner. The implicit assumption is that you can't be good at both. If you want to excel at science, everything else needs to come second. If you want to be a clinician, you can't waste your time with egg-headed research. You'll get out of touch with what it feels like to be in the room with a patient, your instincts will dull, and your knowledge will only be theoretical. But Scott Stanley is truly one of the rare people who excels at both. He is the consummate scientist practitioner. Moreover, I would say his body of work is a testament that social science can matter. It's easy as a scientist to exist in a bubble where you write papers for and with the same 40 people. You all get together at conferences and pat each other on the back about how smart all of you are. But in reality, your work never goes beyond that insular group. Certainly it doesn't impact the average person on the street. But Scott has a gift for getting our best stuff out to the people, for ensuring that scientific research will matter in the lives of those who will benefit from it most. His clinical impact through his research has reached thousands, even tens of thousands. He is truly one of my academic heroes. When I was first about to meet Scott, my academic mentor warned me that Scott has a way of teaching that casts a spell over people, and I'm excited for all of you to fall under his spell tonight. It is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Scott Stanley.
Good evening. I'm delighted to be here. I'm delighted that you're all here. And this is a talk I enjoy giving, so I hope you'll enjoy hearing it. And I've upgraded it for those of you that have heard some of it before. So here we go. I do want to just thank a number of people. I could go on for a bit, but David Nelson, thank you very much. And the committee for the Marjorie Hinckley Endowed Chair, thank you for inviting me. Dean Ogles, thank you. It's delightful talking with you and reminiscing about Ohio and other things today. Alan Hawkins, a long-term friend and colleague. Scott Braithwaite, beginning to seem like a long-term friend and colleague. I don't think we'll catch up to me and Alan, but we're getting there. And Amber Johnson, just thank you so much for all you've done to make everything smooth. What I'm going to talk about tonight, you could really think about this way, is the formation of commitment and what happens these days that affects commitment. So many in this room are interested in the topic of marriage, and you're probably interested in the theme of commitment. And I think we've seen in the last, those of you that are old enough to sort of say a statement like this, in the last 40 or 50 years, really dramatic changes that nobody would have really even predicted 40 years ago in terms of the way families form and the way that marriages form or don't form. And what I want to do is give a talk that's really about research and theory in a few specific areas that speak to the dynamics of the way commitment often doesn't form so well these days, and I hope to conclude in that some ways that people can form the best and strongest commitments. I want to acknowledge two of my longest term deepest colleagues, Galena Rhodes and Howard Markman. Worked with both of them for a long time. And the work that I'll be talking about tonight, the work that Scott actually mentioned quite a bit, is the work with Howard Markman and I and colleagues. Galena is a part of that. But what I'll talk about tonight is especially things that Galena Rhodes and I have worked on together. So what's happening? What's happening in terms of marriage and divorce? It used to be that you could encapsulate a lot of what was going on about marriage by just knowing the divorce rate. But the divorce rate, which is the one in orange here, has actually come way down. I don't have a chart that's as good as this one that I found a couple weeks ago that goes out further, but it just continues this trend. And what you can see is marriage was way up after World War II. Divorce really had a spike after World War II. And then the divorce rate really peaked 1979 and 81 in terms of the rate per 1,000. There's many different ways to think about what the divorce rate is, and this is just sort of one of the crude ways to sort of map it. But I just want you to notice the way those numbers are trailing down now. The divorce rate for a first-time marrying couple today, the projected divorce rate, is probably somewhere in the 30s, where it used to really be in around 55%. It's probably edging under 40% now. But that doesn't tell nearly the whole story, because that by itself is kind of a good story. But there's other stories that are happening that are kind of concerning, because one of the things that's happening is just fewer and fewer people are going to get married. And another thing that's happening that's kind of curious and has good and bad to it is that the age of marriage keeps going up and up and up. And I imagine the limit is death, but it's could make for some fairly short marriages till death do us part. Well, that's next week, dear. We're up to 30, and I think we just peaked over age 30 for males this fall, and it's usually about 2 years behind that for females. In Europe, it's higher, so if you want to get married even later than that, you could go to Norway or somewhere like that. Now, this is an extraordinary thing that's happened here, and it's multi-determined. There are many things that explain why this has happened, and I'm not even going to try to explain all of them. I'm going to try to comment on a couple of them. But I call this the big delay. And there's a whole field, and a number of your scholars here are really focused on the field of emerging adulthood, and just the fact that people are taking longer and longer and longer to kind of develop their lives, to kind of get things together, to be finishing their education, and then settling down. Now, in this period of the big delay, I think there's several kinds of people with regard to marriage and relationships. One are people that I think of as seekers of the one. They are actively right now looking for somebody to marry. They're anticipating marriage soon. As Jason Carroll and Brian Willoughby here would say, they have a short-term time horizon, a short-term marital horizon. They're seeing it as pretty soon. But there's also a lot of people, and I think this is a large group of what I call determined delayers. They're like, I'm not going to settle down until 30 or 32 or 31, and I'm 23 and I'm 20 or 24. And it's a long way off. And then I think there's other people that are just sort of, well, we'll see what happens when it happens, and they're kind of wandering around. Part of what I think is really fascinating just to keep in mind as I make other comments about relationships these days and how things develop, that all these folks are in the same pool. They're all together. Now, probably here at BYU, you got more people in that first category than a lot of campuses that don't want to put any pressure on, like what happens just this week in terms of you finding your mate, but I would imagine that I couldn't go too many places in this country where you could find more people in that first category. But you go beyond here and other places, it's very interesting to just think about the fact that people are in relationships now where one person's actually looking for the one and the other person's looking to delay as long as possible, and could even be in a pretty serious and consequential relationship with that person, thinking, well, you're not the one, I'm not even remotely ready to settle down. That's a really interesting dynamic. And because of the length of this time, it's sort of an issue that didn't really used to exist in the same degree. Now, there's some pros and there's some cons of the big delay. One of the benefits is that people, in taking more time, are making more deliberate, careful choices at times in a mate. So some people are actually using that time well to be a little more careful in their search and being a little more wise about it and not jumping in too quick or just with the first person that they really feel a strong connection with. So that's good. Another thing that's sort of positive, but it's a positive that bounces off a negative, which is delaying because of self-insuring. That a lot of people are actually delaying so they can kind of have their entire economic career and personal life together before they would join their life with another, so that if and when it blows up, I can take care of myself. So you can see where there's positive and negative in that. Now, the costs are interesting to think about. One of the costs that Galina and I talk about, and I tilt conservative and Galina is liberal, and But one of the things, we have a lot of viewpoints that are similar in these kinds of things. And one of the things that's fascinating to think about is you can actually, in many areas in life, more experience is great. More experience in serious romantic relationships at some point is not so great. That the experience comes with costs. And one of the really dramatic costs that is very evident in how things have changed in terms of union formation in America is people now, by the time they do settle down, or they think they're ready to settle down, there's really significant percentage of people already have a child by somebody else. And now they have to make that relationship work already having children. That used to be pretty much a phenomena of second marriages, but it's increasingly, and with a pretty significant percentage, a phenomena of first marriages. Now, 4 massive shifts in marriage, and then I'll move on to really specifics conceptually about commitment. One is just expectations have skyrocketed. People expect more and more and more. People expect sort of perfection in a soulmate. And while you could take a definition of soulmate that sort of was focused on people lining up with somebody of similar beliefs and values, really what that means culturally, as we all know, is kind of expecting perfection in a partner and finding that person who will just think you are marvelously perfect just the way you are. And as I've already implied, marriage is delayed, but not sex, living together, or having children. We've also moved to where marriage is less of a cornerstone for life to a capstone. It's seen by many as kind of the thing you've done that's sort of like the crowning achievement in the first part of your life, as opposed to something where you join your life in commitment to somebody else and develop a life together. That's a dramatic and important change. And lastly, and I won't speak a lot about this, but I'll allude to it in a couple of places in my talk, we talk a lot about economic inequality, and you may have different views on that or different philosophies about that. But another kind of inequality that is just striking now is the kind of have and have not thing that's opening up in the US in terms of people who have marriages and people that don't. And the most striking, simple version of that is pretty much the people now that are doing marriage in high percentages and are going to succeed at it are college graduates. And then there's everybody else. And those kind of divisions about things that used to be sort of universally participated in are very tough on society. Now, I want to say a little bit about theoretically why I think commitment develops, and then we'll talk about some things related to that. First, people meet, they get attracted. That's a very interesting little place to talk, but I'm not going to spend time there. Attraction's kind of mysterious. It's kind of nice to sort of leave it that way. So 2 people have met somehow, and they've gotten attracted. And then they develop an interesting kind of anxiety, which is, I am really attracted to you and attached to you, but what if you don't want to stay in my life? What if we're not going to have a future together? So this is this isn't like an attachment disorder kind of attachment anxiety. This is a normal developmental attachment or anxiety where I'm so connected with you, now I'm anxious that I'm not going to get to keep this thing we have going in my life. And I think, and you can have many definitions or reasons to think about why commitment develops or why marriage exists, but psychologically, one of the things that a really well-formed and clear commitment does is it secures the attachment for both those 2 people and their children. So that's a major purpose of commitment, and it matters a lot then if it forms well or doesn't form well in people's lives. Now, one of the things that's a very important characteristic that comes along with understanding the nature of commitment is that it, in part, is about signaling. So it's not just my disposition toward you and my interest in you, am I willing to invest in you, but what am I willing to signal to other people about the nature of our relationship? So secure commitments, strong commitments, are clearly signaled. There's something that really says, declarative to others, that we are a team with a future. We're an us. But ambiguity is the flavor of the age. One of the things that's I've been writing and thinking about for a long time, if you watch how relationships have changed, over the last 40 years, they are so much more ambiguous now before marriage in terms of what is that relationship? What's the understanding between those two people? What do they have in mind? Where is it going? And here's some of the examples of the phenomena of ambiguity. I won't go through all of them in detail, but just to mention them, my favorite one is that first one. You can go to websites that will help you determine whether what you're going to do together tomorrow night is a date or not. And it's really, I enjoy this kind of stuff. I remember one time I was interviewing somebody that was maybe 22 or so, and I was asking her, well, what would it mean if it was a date? And I was just watching her anxiety like crawl toward the ceiling about, if it's a date, I mean, it just means so much more. There's so much more about it. Hookups, fundamentally ambiguous. Soft breakups. We don't even break up clearly anymore. Part of that's electronic. People I can follow you. I'd have to do all that work of like not following you anymore or unfriending all the friends. It's just so, but there's another part of that in the ambiguity of the age, which is I'm done with you for now, but if I don't find somebody better, you're on the back burner. I really think that exists, and people have a sense that, you're not my first choice, but you're sort of an asset if times get tough. Ghosting is an interesting one. Like, where'd you go? We were talking. We were usually this is electronic. We were sort of communicating, and then you just dropped off the planet. One of the things about ghosting, I'll just say this, just a little nugget of advice, because a lot of what I'm going to talk about here are just things related to the nature of getting good information about a person and their commitment to you. I'll say this, ghosting is where somebody just completely stops communicating with you and they don't explain why, for those of you that don't know what ghosting is. So that's the definition. What's interesting about it is it's massively frustrating for the person that isn't the ghost, because they're in mystery about what happened and why. But you should recognize if you're ever ghosted, you actually got a ton of information about the person and the partner, and you can move on, okay? It's like, well, you may not know why, but you kind of know everything you need to know. So, and that's a big deal these days because it's not ambiguous anymore. You've been ghosted, that may not be the person for you. Just talking, that's a phenomenon now, especially in campus. Cohabitation, I'm going to say a fair amount about, just because it's the quintessential ambiguous form of relationships, where if you know two people are living together, I would suggest, and I think you can develop this point fairly well empirically, that doesn't tell you much of anything about their level of commitment. They could be really committed, they could be not committed. In contrast, if somebody says we're engaged, we're going steady, we're in a relationship, that's even information about commitment. We have a future, this is my life partner, we're married. All of those things really are declarative and informative on some level about commitment, but not just knowing two people are living together. Now, why all this ambiguity? Just a few quick reasons. One, I'll go into a little more depth. One is, I think if you think about the big delay, people that want to stay in the dance have a lot of motivation to not be very clear at the age of 24. If I'm thinking my horizon is 32, I don't really want to be getting that seriously attached to you. So why would I want to be clear? And I sure don't want you to start up a discussion with me about it being clear, because I'm committed to the future, and that isn't necessarily with you. Another reason is fear of getting on the wrong train. This is a big one, because the way people's expectations now have gotten so extreme about the perfection of a marriage partner and what you should be able to get in marriage, the fear has skyrocketed that, imagine a woman, let's call her Samantha, and she's in the train station looking for the one. This is her goal, and the one would be the right train. Samantha's biggest fear is committing to this train that just came into the station and then wondering if the really best train for her came in the very next time. the next train into the station. That fear has been written about well. It's really dramatic in some people's lives, and that keeps people from committing because they're waiting for perfection or they're searching for perfection, which perfection isn't coming, right? Just to be clear, in case. And my favorite to talk about of these reasons for ambiguity is a more deeply motivated ambiguity, which works like this. Because of the way divorce took off in the 70s and the 80s, and then stayed at a high rate, and now we don't talk as much about this, but really what's replaced divorce as the divorce rates come down are families that were never married, but they are highly unstable for the children and break up. So a lot of the instability for children has continued to increase over the decades, even as the divorce rate has come down. And I think with all the instability and the uncertainty about marriage and the idea that, well, could you make this work? Is it really possible that people do this? I know people used to do that, but who does that these days? That the real fear is, well, I don't want to be clear about what I really want, that I really am committed to you, that this really matters to me. The more clear I am, the deeper you can hurt me when you reject me, because I've put it out there. I've said it clearly, I've said it to myself, I've said it to my friends, I've said it to my family. That, I don't know if it really does hurt more, but I think there's a perception that's gonna hurt more. And if I just keep it vague, even within myself, and don't kind of say out loud what I really want, it's gonna hurt less when I don't get it. So one of the things that's really changed in 40 years, now it's morphed a bit, but I think it's really changed, is there used to be pretty clearly delineated, more universal steps and stages toward marriage, really kind of clear places where you were taking a step up in commitment and clarity between two people. And here's a great example. So in my day, and you might have noticed that I'm 32, plus a few decades, but in my day, think about this, because it's not this simple now, because we live in the age of ambiguity. You asked a girl out, say in high school, and you went out a few times on dates. You know, you actually had to formulate like a bit of a plan, which, by the way, gave the other person a whole lot of information about how lame or together you were right off the bat. So that's a pretty good model, actually, in some ways. There's some downsides, but you formed a plan, you're dating, you've gone out a couple of times, and say you really like each other. The next thing was one of you would say, do you want to go steady? Sure. That's the whole discussion. Why is that the whole discussion? That's the whole discussion because the form of commitment and the understanding of what that meant was so unambiguously clear and so well understood by everybody. Nobody, well, somebody would have been, but nobody really was dumb enough to like start going around saying they were going steady with somebody who they hadn't checked first with that person if they were. Okay? I'm sure somebody did that, but it was a culturally strong emblem or signal of commitment that was well understood and mutually declarative, and you didn't have to really have a big discussion about it. It was so clear in the guidance of the culture. And this gets to a really interesting point. I'm going to mix my metaphors here because I'm talking about steps and stages, but now I want to talk about scripts. You know, there were clear scripts for sort of how you did this and how you developed toward developing a marriage and developing a family. And that's really pretty blown up now. Now, you could argue, and I know a lot of colleagues and people that can argue pretty well, that there's some good things that have come from sort of leaving some things behind. And so there's some arguments to be made that it wasn't always ever perfect, all right? So that makes sense. But think about it this way. Without clear scripts, what that does is it means it's very much more dependent now on people being individually skilled at figuring things out, because the culture isn't carrying any weight for people anymore. They have to really be able to figure things out and talk things out in their relationships. And it turns out people are actually probably not very good at that. They probably never were, but society provided the script that doesn't exist as much. Now, one consequence of that is, I think, with more ambiguity, as you could imagine, there's increased chances of asymmetrical commitment, meaning the two people are not on the same page and are not equally committed to each other. Because if it's so unclear and hard to determine clarity, then you're going to get mismatches more. Now, this is a sort of a drawing version of a picture, but this is very accurate to the picture that I got. It was very hard to find, when I started talking about this metaphor, a good picture of a teeter-totter. And the reason why, and I mean the teeter-totters I remember as in my childhood, which were death-defying teeter-totters. These days, you know, if you find you can find a teeter-totter, it'll go up 1 foot on each side. There'll be like 8 inches of rubber under it, and the kids will be in helmets, right? Because just wouldn't want anybody to take any kind of risk. But this is kind of reality about relationships. Relationships are risky. And this is a beautiful image. I've never found a better picture than this. Because notice this little girl up high on the teeter. What's the risk of the teeter? I mean, teeter-totter is really fun if you have an equally committed teeter-tottering partner, right? You know, you kind of balance it out. You can go up and down. But the risk of the teeter-totter was really in being dropped, because the plummet would be sudden. And you'll notice this little girl, she's got her legs up. If you wanted to protect yourself from an unreliable partner on the teeter-totter, where are your legs? Yeah, and you'd try to catch yourself. Now, if those of you that remember a high teeter-totter, how well did that actually work? You were always surprised when they dumped you. Now, what I love about this came from a photo, and I did not crop this. I wish I had a little more, but look at the kid on the left. That kid's, excuse the language, butt is already half off that seat, right? They're turned, they're about to bail, maybe they're going to go play with these kids chasing the ball, or I don't know what's about to happen. But what's remarkable about this photo is the little girl that's in the vulnerable position is like still all in. She's looking right at this person who's about to fall off, and there's no sign that she even sees it. And I think that's asymmetrical commitment. A lot of times people don't even see it because we lack the forms and the relationship structures that kind of force clarity. Now, we've published a number of things on asymmetrical commitment, and I'll just quickly mention some things and then move on. Not surprisingly, it's associated with lower relationship quality, more aggression, attachment issues. So people that are more avoidant attached tend to be the less committed partner in asymmetrically committed relationships. People that are more the anxious attached tend to be more committed. There's less likely to be mutual plans for marrying, more likely to be a cohabiting relationship than even just a dating relationship, because cohabiting is murky. It's easy to have ambiguity in cohabitation. And this is the one that people should be really aware of. It doesn't abate when people get married. I think sometimes people know they're more committed than their partner, and they're thinking, if I can just get this person to the altar, everything will be fine. No, it isn't all fine. Now, there's asymmetries naturally when people are dating and getting to know each other and pursuing each other. That's not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about there's an existing relationship, and it's really not even in commitment. Timing and sequence matters a lot to understand commitment. And this is where this audience is a really interesting one for me to speak to, because you've got to be the least likely to cohabit group percentage-wise that I usually get to speak to in terms of cohabiting before marriage. And it'll happen, but you know, this is a lower percentage. But this is a big deal out in, you know, society. And probably 70-75% of couples in America are going to live together before marriage. And it's a window for understanding some things about commitment. Now, I want to just say a couple things really quickly just to make this point. I'm going to talk about some dynamics related to commitment and cohabitation, but it's important to understand that there is also a sort of class and cultural difference here, that cohabitation, especially in the more risky ways and in the quicker ways and the ways that don't tend to turn out as well, is most likely with people that are economically disadvantaged. But I think there's some dynamics there for both. And generally speaking, people that are more likely to cohabit or more cohabit with more people tend to be people that are less religious, have more family history of instability, and have less traditional beliefs about marriage and sex. So just keep that in mind that I said that, but now I want to talk about, I'm going to skip that one. I want to talk about some things about the dynamics that I think are universal. In measuring commitment, one of the things that we do, and there's different models of commitment in research on marriage and relationships, I like to break it down into dedication and constraint. Dedication is I want to be with you, I want a future with you, I'm into you, I want us to be an us with a future. And constraint is more all the kinds of things that make it hard to break up. And constraints are things like, well, we've invested a lot together and we would lose some things if we broke up. Peer pressure, social pressure, beliefs or views about divorce if we're talking about marriage. Constraints are really kind of neither good nor bad. They just sort of, they accumulate, and a lot of times they're actually good and they provide sort of some guardrails in relationships. But constraint is a really interesting thing compared to dedication. So pay attention to those. Now, a really interesting phenomenon in the history of social science of marriage and cohabitation is that there's been a finding that has existed over and over in study after study after study after study after study, you're probably getting that idea, that people that live together before marriage tend to not do as well in marriage, on average. Everything's on average when you're talking to a researcher. And in a variety of different kind of manifestations, and divorce rate is just one of them. There have been many reports in the last 15 years that this cohabitation effect doesn't exist anymore, and pretty prominent journal articles. I'm just mentioning a couple there. Now, the belief that sociologists have had about why it would go away, and if it's gone away, the theory of why it's gone away, is it's become so ubiquitous and so accepted that there's no stigma about it. So that theory is really that the risk was driven by stigma. I don't actually think that was probably ever the case. That's never made a lot of sense to me, but I understand the sociological literature and why people got there. Now, the headline I just want you to take from that is this idea that it's gone away. And cohabitation is so interesting to the public. It's so interesting to people in developing relationships and looking for partners and thinking about marriage. It gets headlines all the time. These kind of findings come out routinely, and you'll get a raft of stories in the media about cohabitation. This is around 2014 when one of the studies came out. With this headline, call your dad, living together before marriage does not lead to divorce. Now, first off, I just don't know why you wouldn't call your mom, okay? I guess dad's the one with the shotgun or something, right? Now, before I get into that, this isn't actually even the most interesting part of this from our perspective, so I'm coming to that. But a really interesting thing happened in this fall because a number of prominent sociologists have been saying the risk is no longer there, it's no longer there. And then a couple of really prominent sociologists at Stanford said, oh, but it's back. And what's interesting is they did analyses that went further following people in the same data sets that sociologists have been using for 10 or 15 years, where they didn't have as far of an outcome to follow people. And what Rosenfeld and Roessler found is that it remains associated with the risk of divorce, except in the first year. But in every other year of marriage, it's associated with a higher risk. Now, I won't go further in detail. I have a rich blog article about that and all these things if you want to follow up on that. I also am not going to go into detail here, except the details on the slide, and I will put these slides on my website, Sliding versus Deciding. But one of the really interesting things, and I remember Alan Hawkins and I have talked about this for a long time, the thing that's often not said, and Alan, you and I must have had this talk back in 2003 when the Teachman article came out. What's often not said, even when people are saying there's no risk, is that the no added risk headline actually only fits for people with certain characteristics. And the headlines are never qualified. The headlines are never qualified. Now, I want to get to where we focus here and some really, I think, very fascinating insights about the nature of commitment. Before I do that, just to say, there's really been almost no evidence. I just say almost because I'm a researcher and I know where I could find a little bit of pocket of evidence, but virtually there's no evidence for what is widely believed by most people that living together before marriage should improve your odds because you get to test things, you get to try things out. Why wouldn't that improve your odds? Well, there's 3 reasons why it might not. One is selection effects, and that's just speaks to this thing I was talking about a bit ago, that there's a difference between people that cohabit and people that don't. And as it turns out, and this is really clear, this is very much in the mix, that people that were always at greater risk to not doing well in marriage have also been the most likely to live together before marriage, and the most likely to live together early, and the most likely to live together in the riskiest sort of ways. And that's just part of selection. You can think of it as baked-in risk. A widely ignored but fascinating study, and I think one of the best social science papers related to marriage and cohabitation ever written, is by Axon and Barber in 1997. And I'll just give you the headline there, is what they said, and the paper's beautiful for the theory and the expression of all this, is that living together changes how people think about marriage. It reduces their sense and their belief that marriage is special, and it increases their acceptance of divorce. And they show this. That's interesting. So net of selection, what's already baked in, it actually changes what people think about marriage and about divorce. The one, though, that we like to talk the most about is inertia. Now, what's inertia? Just to remind you from your physics class, if you are forgetting, who would forget that? Inertia is the property of an object that relates to how much it will resist changes in its present motion or state. So it's how much energy you'd have to apply to make this object move. So if I had a tennis ball and a bowling ball up here and I kicked them, you probably are going to predict that the tennis ball is going to move from its current course a lot easier than the bowling ball. You can see why I don't really want to demonstrate that, but that's inertia. It's harder to move the bowling ball from what it's already doing. So here's a quiz for you. What do you think has more inertia? Inertia is related to constraints, okay? Link up inertia now in your head to what I said about constraint. What has more inertia, dating and not living together, or living together? Everything else being equal. If you could make everything identical about a relationship except the difference in living together or not, which is going to be harder to break up? Living together. It has to be. I mean, this is almost, I was speaking to a group of economists once and I said, this is kind of an axiom, isn't it? And they said, yeah, we think you got one there. You have to do the research wrong to mess this up, okay? Which people can do, and there may be some interesting kind of way somebody studies this at some point that comes up with a different angle on that, but now, cohabiting relationships break up all the time. They've actually, 20 years ago, a couple starts living together in America, you pretty well could bet some serious money, if you were a betting person, that they're going to marry within a year. It was a signal of the progressing relationship toward commitment in marriage for those that were doing it then. Now, couples that cohabit before marriage are more likely to break up than ever get to the altar. That's how much has changed. These things are changing so fast. So, here's what happens. And this is one of our papers, me and Galena and Howard. I've mentioned dedication and constraint. I'm not going to define the scales or anything. I just want you to get a flavor of what's happening in the shape of those curves. And those are the shapes of the trajectories of dedication to my partner and constraint, one measure of constraint with my partner, before and after the transition to living together. Notice that dedication, people may be increasing in dedication leading up to living together, but it, on average, flatlines once they move in. And I'll just say this without getting into a lot of detail. That's actually not a great level to enter a marriage with, right there on that scale. You'd want it to be like another point higher that I'm not even showing on that graph. Constraints, they take a significant jump and then they really accelerate, like put the gas down on it in terms of the things. Thinking again about inertia, the things that are going to make it harder to unwind this relationship if I've made a misstep, if I've not made a good choice. Do you see where I'm going here? So that leads to this more refined just statement of the issue, what inertia is, it's really developing substantial constraints before dedication has matured between two people. That's a real risk. Now, that leads to a really interesting hypothesis that I'm not giving to you as guidance at this point. I just want to tell you this is a great scientific hypothesis, and it's been tested many times now, that those who do live together before marriage, there's probably two groups within that. People that had already decided mutually, I don't know how many times I can use the word mutual, but I'll probably even step it up now between now and the end of the talk, mutually decided beforehand that they had a future together in marriage versus those who hadn't. There should be a difference because the first couples, they could be at risk for a lot of other things, but it's not inertia, all right? Because they had decided it before they made it harder to break up. Inertia is about taking a step in a relationship that makes it harder to unwind it at a point where it really isn't so well advised. Things aren't clear enough yet to have taken that step. This hypothesis, this specific version of it, has been supported in 6 different samples and 7 different publications. It's a very, very strong hypothesis, and there's many things in social science that do not replicate at all. I don't know any place where this hasn't shown up where somebody's looked for it. It's a very strong hypothesis. Now, here's the moment of reflection for those of you that are not married yet. Inertia is not unique to cohabitation. So I've just laid out a pretty interesting sort of hypothesis and thought about why living together might be more risky than not before marriage, or at least is riskier for a certain group. And I'm taking from that some principles about the development of commitment. That's what I want you to get so far. But what I want you to think about, I'm not going to ask for a show of hands right now and examples, but I would love to actually come back here sometime and just talk to groups of undergraduates and hear about forms of things that are the same principle I'm describing, but affect students here at BYU. It's something different. It won't be cohabitation, because the odds are very low for students here at Brigham Young doing that. But it's going to be something else. Here's just one example that I could think of. Prematurely, too soon, sort of telling your friends and family that you think this is the one. That can start to put a constraint on you. That can start to create expectations. Oh, well, this is it. This is going to be the one. That sometimes people have to, at times, do something like that sort of too soon in a way that starts to get hard to back out of. And any number of other things that you might think about. It's going to be different forms in a local group or a different cultural group, but inertia is always going to be an issue where sometimes people are prematurely locking themselves in while they're in the search for a solid choice in a mate. Lastly, sliding versus deciding. Phrase that I like pretty much. So let's just go back to cohabitation for a second. So if cohabitation is associated with increased constraints, people be careful about that, right? No. Very clear. And the researchers who first brought a lot of attention to this were Wendy Manning and Pam Smock. Done a lot of great research on cohabitation, studying people in a qualitative study, interviewing people about, well, how did you come to live together? And they found that over 50% of people really said it was like not a decision. It wasn't a discussion. They slid into it. And what that looks like is one's over there 2 nights a week, and 4 nights a week, and 5 nights a week, and 6 nights a week, and they start to have space in the closet, and they start to have a drawer, and maybe they start to leave iPhone chargers there. I think an ominous sign might be when the game console moves. Just trying to keep modern here. But it's gradual. It's not like, what are we doing here? What's the future? Let's make a decision. Let's talk about it. People don't do that. And you could say, well, why not? That's kind of a big step. It seems like it's an obvious big step, and if people are avoiding talking about it, and quantitatively we get even a much bigger number of people that say it was more of a slide than a decide. Let's go back to what I'm saying about ambiguity. It's really actually pretty uncomfortable, and it takes a lot of skill to have this kind of talk. And again, apply this to, doesn't have to be just cohabitation. It's all kinds of things. I don't actually really want to rock the cart. I don't really want to push you to find out where you think this is going. Now, honestly, if it's actually like the first date, probably don't have that discussion, especially not about number of children and other kind, that's. But after a while of like hanging around each other and getting to know each other, what people start to do by their avoidance and their sort of comfort with ambiguity is they're increasing other kinds of risks, including being in an asymmetrically committed relationship and finding out in a very unpleasant way after more time has gone on that you really weren't as into me as I was into you. Now, there's also important evidence that, speed and earliness of transitions, of potentially life-altering transitions in relationships matters by researchers here at BYU. Sex earlier than later is a risk factor. And what they talk about, Busby, Carroll, and Willoughby here, is that it sort of stunts relationship development. People are doing some things, they're not doing other things, like talking and getting to know each other. You can also apply that to just all kinds of just sort of chemically fueled sort of, people really get in love and get overcome, and that's good, that's wonderful, that's a great feeling, but you can sort of be sort of blind and dumb during that time, and people aren't necessarily coming out of that sometimes and really talking and learning about the other, or just moving in together so fast. Sharon Sassler and colleagues talk about this. Dan Lichter gave a talk here he talked a lot about inequality 4 years ago. So moving through these things quickly is a risk factor. So sliding is not always bad. But when we're talking about potentially life-altering relationship transitions, it can't be good. And I don't even mean just the individual sliding, but individuals can slide. Individuals can decide, but I really mean two people talking about what's going on when an important transition is happening. Because what's really going on these days is people are often giving up options before they make a choice. That's what's happening with inertia, is people are sort of missing the key moments to make a decision when it was most critical and getting locked in or stuck places longer than they otherwise would have been. I want you to think more about this next point I make than anything I've said tonight, because this is like the heart of what commitment's about. In contrast to sliding, commitments are decisions. Whenever you're making a commitment, even if it's like a small C commitment, but we're really talking tonight about big commitments, you're making a choice to give up other choices. That's what commitment is. Come back to dedication and constraint for a second. When somebody is committing to another in marriage or for life, they're choosing to be constrained. Sliding is becoming constrained when you haven't yet made a choice. Do you see why that's just going to be such a worse idea? And that's what we've moved to culturally. That's the dominant form now, is sliding through all kinds of relationship transitions that actually are consequential, or that can be life-changing. They're not all life-changing, but they can be consequential and life-changing. It's great to be constrained if you chose it. That's commitment. It's not great if you slid into it and then have a sense, well, I don't even know how I got here. So commitment's choosing to be constrained. And this speaks to the power of a well-formed commitment, which transforms one's motivation from it's all about me to there's an us with a future. There's this me-you team thing. There's my willingness to sacrifice for you and my ability to count on your willingness to sacrifice for me. That's a great commitment. And it's constrained, but I chose it. And I knew what it was, and it's not always happy, it's not always easy, but this is what I bought into. Transition by itself is not transformation. So people a lot of times think, well, like I said, well, maybe we can just get to the altar and things will be fine. If things weren't fine before the altar, the odds are not great. They're going to be fine afterwards. Sometimes they are. There's things that can change, but it's a concern. Deciding sets up a stronger follow-through. Now, I have some points that are just specific To individuals here that are not yet married, I just wanted to leave you with some specific bits of advice. They're all sort of already throughout the talk that I've given. I'm generally actually sort of a dismal, not optimist. I have a dismal perspective on the future of marriage. I do believe, as Steve Knox said before he died, really great sociologist, somebody I admired the work of great. He said, the last thing he wrote was a chapter where he said marriage would be becoming more and more important. I want you to notice what I just said. He said it would become more important. He didn't say it would become more prevalent. He knew it was going to become rarer and rarer. And what his point was, he and I at the time, and he was really further than me in the theory of this, were really both becoming sort of independently very enamored with theories about signaling and the importance of signals between partners and between two people and their community about the nature of their commitment. And he said, as marriage gets rarer and rarer and cohabitation gets more and more common, marriage will become more uniquely powerful in signaling the best relationships, the strongest relationships. I want to say there's some cohabiting couples that have amazing relationships, but on average, it's a much less stable form. And it's not because there's something wrong with the people, it's because there's just a lot less formation of a strong commitment together about cohabitation than marriage. And Steve saw that coming. So advice for you all, advice for singles who are searching. If you're not searching, well, actually, this will be good advice for you too. Take it slow. And by that, I just mean don't go too fast. Keep your eyes open, be gathering information, thinking about. Researchers used to consistently in this field talk about people doing an inadequate search, not searching long enough for the best match in a mate. And you can find people that search too little and go too quickly, and you can find people that search too long. There's consequences of each, and it's hard to say what the ideal is, but take it slow. Look for valid signals of commitment. This is going to be different in different groups, different cultures, different traditions, but there'll be things that are reliable signals when one stops and thinks about it of somebody that's more committed than not to me than somebody else. And sometimes the signals are things that happen in the unscripted moments when things aren't clear. So the little sacrifices, the little thoughtfulness, things that, well, you didn't have to do. One of the really interesting things about signal theory and the concept that I call constraints is that when people are more constrained, their behavior tells you less about what they value and what they want. And that just makes sense, right? When somebody's options are constrained by whatever, just constraints, big picture, all different kinds of constraints. When people are more constrained, what they choose tells you less about what they actually want. So you have to look carefully for what's a really good, valid signal. I'll give you a quick example, which is of this next one, which is a red flag. I was in an airport, I'm often in airports, but I was in an airport about 5 years ago, minding my own business. I'm sure I was thinking about this stuff, because I actually think about this stuff a lot. I really do, because I just jazzed by it. And I'm unfortunately disturbing my peace is overhearing the conversation between this two people, this young couple, and they were waiting for their plane like I was waiting for my plane. And she had like short shorts on and a tank top. Not dressed really warmly, okay? And I don't know what he had, but he had jeans on and probably maybe a long sleeve shirt. She wanted to put more clothes on so she wouldn't be cold on the plane. I hate being cold on planes. I immediately tuned into this. And I'm thinking now I'm listening and I'm thinking, why is this conversation going any longer? Why is this even a discussion? She wants to put more clothes on to be warm on the plane, and he didn't want her to. I'm like, what on earth? This guy's lucky, by the way, this wasn't Galena sitting there, because she would have waited for the moment that he went to the restroom and walked up to her and said, dump him. I mean, just the only theory I could come up with is that he liked so well how she looked wearing less, and he liked so much how he looked being with her the way she looked, that he didn't want her to cover up. There could be other reasons. I don't really care a lot. I didn't admire much the fact that he couldn't make this little sacrifice. And I'm thinking, it's a little behavior with tons of information. When you get tons of information, believe it. Look for someone who shares your beliefs and values. I do not need to say that too much to this group. Avoid high-cost slides. I already said enough about that. Do premarital training. Now, one last little bit about this. Earlier the better. Most people do premarital education a few weeks, a couple months before they get married. I'm a big fan of doing it a year or so ahead, and you're not going to like the reason why. I think couples should give themselves a chance to discover something that breaks them up. How does that make it for attractive, right? I mean, who wants to do that? But that's a great, you test it with a test that doesn't cost much as early as you can after you're really sort of thinking that way. Lastly, and I'll end on this note, be realistic about potential mates. I talked about soulmates early on and the degree to which people now are really looking for perfection, and the odd way that coincides, by the way, with dating and electronic media now. People actually really feel it's sort of possible that they could find that perfect person, and it's a trap. And the only thing I like to say about this, just to sum this up, is that don't really look for a perfect mate, because you're probably not offering that person perfection. What you might be offering them is the ability to make a serious decision, a commitment, to be constrained with them in a life that you're building together, to have a future together where you're really behind each other. That's a strong way to go through life, and I think it's harder and harder for people to do. Thank you very much.
We have about 10 minutes for a question and answer session with Dr. Stanley. So if you're interested in asking a question, I'm going to leave it to him to select a few people to call upon. As you're called upon, we're going to bring a roving mic to you so it's easier for everybody to hear your question. And if you would just state your name and where you're from, that would be great. So.
In your opinion, what effects does pornography have on people that aren't married versus people that are married in general, just the effects of pornography?
I think so the question is about the effects of pornography. It's a very complicated thing, and it's affected by many things. And it actually would also allow me to make another point that I often make in this talk. When I say things are unclear there, I really mean about the social science. And different people are arguing. I follow, I think, all these people on Twitter that are doing this research, and some are people that are here. You get this researcher saying this, you get this researcher saying this. There's certainly some things that qualify that in the research, but the point I want to make to you also, too, is your beliefs and values are not necessarily governed by what researchers are saying, right? So it's important to make that distinction, because there is actually a lot of complexity to that research. Some things are really clear. Solo use is particularly that the partner doesn't know about. That there's some things that are associated with even more risk than others. There's some couples that use it together, and if you look at what those researchers are saying, that those relationships seem relatively okay. That may not make sense to you, or it might make sense to you. I'm just sort of speaking to the research. One of the really interesting things, and I forget, it's one of the folks here. Jason, is this you or Brian or both of you? The really interesting article in the Institute for Family Studies blog, which I often author things in, as well as my own blog, that way many more young men are using pornography than their female partner thinks are. That's interesting. That's a kind of an asymmetry. And I think asymmetries are always interesting. So I'm speaking as a researcher, and it's a murky field, and there's a lot of people that are studying it right now. And some of them are here. Let's go here, and then we'll come up here.
I really enjoyed
him. Yeah, you. Yep. And then we'll get you two. There you go.
Hey, thank you for coming.
Thank you.
The time between excitement and getting to know someone and then committing to a relationship, that part about the anxiety sometimes is really hard.
Yes.
Are there certain strategies that people use to successfully navigate that anxiety between the excitement and the commitment?
So here's what's difficult about navigating the excitement and the anxiety, or the anxiety between the attachment and the commitment. The problem with it is it's easy for the anxiety to go away if you can tell this person's right where you're at. Right? And if you watch, given that we live in the age of ambiguity, I find this stuff fascinating. What's partly sort of replaced the idea of going steady, that used to be such a strong cultural form just a few decades ago, is the sense that she's my girlfriend, he's my boyfriend. You'll hear people start to use that language, and that actually functions like going steady now. But what's interesting about it is people actually can't tell you very often that they sat down, are we boyfriend and girlfriend? It's more like she'll overhear him say at a party that they're both at, and she's across the room, oh, he referred to me as his girlfriend. Okay, now that's the big rush of reassurance about commitment, because there is a signal and one's really searching for the signal and trying to lock in on it, and there it is. When two people are really both not only falling for each other but developing a commitment for each other, they're both going to be sending signals that are pretty loud and pretty clear. So the tricky part is for the anxious situation, how long does that go? It's always going to exist, even in the best relationships, until things are clarified. The issue about why it can't just go away, because sometimes the answer is this relationship doesn't have a future, or the person isn't thinking the same way, and it does come down to waiting. And this is why, think about what I said a bit ago, when people are constrained or forced or pressed, their signals don't mean as much about what they want. So sometimes people are like squeezing the signal out of their partner, squeezing that person to kind of cough up commitment. And that's not a great thing either, because now you don't have as good information because you kind of made it happen. So I think there's just some degree to which one has to sort of tolerate that anxiety. But if it goes on and on and on, and you're not seeing signal, it's asymmetrical, okay? Because there's going to be some way the other person's going to feel the anxiety and send the signal too, I think. Now, some people are just anxiously attached, by the way, and that may be that's a more difficult dynamic, so does an individual characteristic. But as a general rule, in terms of dyads, if it just goes on and on and on, it's not a good sign. How about, there was a woman. Yeah, come get her, and then we'll get him, and maybe we'll be about out of time. Right up here. Oh, right here. In the red.
I was just wondering if there's been any research done on certain locations where people are more likely to find people that are more inclined to make commitments in marriage and things like that.
So this is a nice question, too. I mean, these are great questions. Can you go to a certain place where people are more inclined to make commitments? So it used to be, and I bet this is still much more true in your culture here than in the broader culture. It used to be people, the real go-tos were things like church. You know, well, there's like a pool of people here that are already like sort of at least signed on to my major value and beliefs. The other one that's interesting in research, and you'll see there's a little bit of a contrast here, is bars, which may, hey, you're similarly signed on to my, no, I don't know. Meeting online has become the most common way people that marry meet. I doubt that's true here, but that's true in America. The research shows that it's now edged out everything. And I'll just say this about the online thing, and then we'll take one more question and we'll be done. It's a fascinating thing because as that's really grown into, I used to be skeptical, and this was actually not appropriate skepticism because it's really an interesting and important phenomenon that's opened up. And initially, I'm talking now 15 years ago or so, I didn't sort of take it so seriously. But it's really serious now. But go back to what I said earlier about there's seekers and there's determined delayers and there's just wanderers and there's also players, okay? And so that's the benefit of that mechanism for lots of people is they now have a lot more ways to sort of find somebody that might be a really good match if they're using the tools that way. The trick is in the very same pool, people are using tools just to hook up. How do you differentiate that? Because people don't want to differentiate this in their profile. Apparently the kiss of death is to say in your profile that you're looking to settle down. Nobody's contacting you. That's a problem. So people have to be wise, but it's become the number one way people meet and marry. One more question. This gentleman here. You had your arm? Yes. Microphone right up here. Can you raise your hand for? Thank you. Right up here. Yeah.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Well, maybe just 3 questions in one.
It's good if you can do it.
Maybe, I am puzzled about, you mentioned about cohabitation is increasing. And because it is increasing, there is, more divorce with cohabitation. But then going back, you really stated that divorce rate is kind of declining generally in the country. And so maybe just speaking a little more about that. And I want to factor that into, what is leading to me asking this question. In a very biblical sense, one of the things that we tend to believe is that things are going to get, more and more out of the way. And so I'm wondering how that could be factored into, this whole research component. And then my last question is just about, emotions. Our emotions really drive us to the greatest esteem most of the time. What is the research around this based on the sliding and then deciding factor?
Let's talk about the. It's a very important observation that you raised about you. Listen to a researcher and they'll sound contradictory, but about things that actually may not be. So the divorce rate has come down substantially in this period of time where more and more people than ever before cohabit. But it's mostly come down because the people marrying are a select group now that is whoppingly low risk to divorce. So as more groups just sort of drop marriage out of the picture, cohabitation's the big story there. The greatest increase in out-of-wedlock childbirth, for example, in the last 4 decades. Wendy Manning just made this point, sociologist at the Population Association of America last year. Most of that growth in out-of-wedlock births in 4 decades has been among cohabiting parents. But the cohabiting unions are much less stable. And the marriages where people cohabited before marriage are less stable than the marriages where people didn't. But overall, the pool of people marrying is increasingly select for doing well. And lastly, I'll just pick up on the emotional thing. This is the really trickiest thing about being wise about searching for a mate and making a choice, because you want to be really in love. You want to be emotionally captured. And who would, I don't know, maybe somebody can make an argument that, oh, you shouldn't want that. I don't think too many people here are going to make that argument. There's times in marriage where it's like that, and you're getting through. You're getting through on constraints, and it doesn't feel so much dedication-y at the time. That's normal. That's actually pretty normal. But you got this sense of a future, and you keep working, things get better, and things wax and wane. But when you're searching, you want that emotion and that connection, that attachment, but you also don't want to be blinded by it. That's why going slower is helpful and not moving too fast during the period of time while one is blinded. And my main point there is kind of a societal argument that we've moved toward it being so normative to slide through these various relationship transitions. A lot of slides are really propelled by emotion or not having a prior decision in the self that I'm going to really resist that slide or that slide. You could get there either way, and it's going to be riskier. Doesn't mean people are doomed. There's a lot of people that kind of do everything wrong that a relationship expert would say to do and turn out fine. And here's a cheery story for you. Maybe I'll end on this uplifting fact. There's a lot of people that do everything just virtually perfectly and end up not happy in marriage. Aren't you glad I said that? But on average, people that do well are making good choices, they're watching the key transitions, and they're making a choice to give up other choices at the right time for the right reason with a good choice in a partner. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Stanley, and as a memento of your visit to BYU, we have a desk clock here that we want to gift to you. It says on the front of it, Marjorie Hinckley Lecture, Dr. Scott Stanley, 2019.
Thank you so much. Thank you. You all don't know this. I love clocks. This is gorgeous. Thank you.
It's about time.
Thank
right?
you very much. Yeah. Yes. It's about time for the right reason.
All right, the benediction now will be offered by Spencer James, an associate professor in the School of Family Life, and then following the benediction, we invite you to come to the corridor for some light refreshments.